In the depths of winter 1939, when temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius and the snow stretched endlessly across the Finnish wilderness, one man became the embodiment of death itself. Hidden in the white silence of the forest, he moved like a ghost through the frozen landscape, his breath invisible, his presence undetectable. The Soviet soldiers who invaded his homeland called him the White Death, a phantom who could strike from nowhere and vanish without a trace. This is the story of Simo Häyhä, a humble farmer turned legendary sniper who in just 100 days would achieve what military historians consider impossible. Armed with nothing but an old rifle and iron determination, he would single-handedly terrorize an entire army and change the course of history. When the Soviet Union launched its massive invasion of Finland on November 30th, 1939, the world expected a swift and brutal conquest. Joseph Stalin's Red Army marched across the border with 750,000 soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 3,000 aircraft. Finland, a small Nordic nation of just 3.7 million people, could muster only 300,000 troops, a handful of tanks, and barely over 100 aircraft. The odds were overwhelming. The Soviet bear had come to devour the tiny Finnish nation, and victory seemed inevitable within weeks. But the Soviets had not counted on the Finnish winter, and they certainly had not counted on men like Simo Häyhä. Born on December 17th, 1905, in the small farming town of Rautjärvi near the Russian border, Häyhä was the seventh of 8 children in a devout Lutheran family. His father Juho ran the Mattila farm operations, while his mother Katriina worked tirelessly as the farmer's wife. From an early age, Simo was different from his siblings. While others stayed indoors during the harsh winters, he ventured into the unforgiving wilderness, learning to read the forest like others read books. The Finnish countryside shaped him into something extraordinary. He spent countless hours hunting small game with an old bolt-action rifle, developing an almost supernatural ability to judge distances and wind patterns. His peers described him as friendly but introverted, a mild-mannered young man who preferred the company of the forest to crowds of people. Little did anyone feared sniper in military history. At 90 know that this quiet farm boy was developing skills that would one day make him the most Terijoki. The army recognized Battalion, serving as a conscript officer in his potential early, sending him to the Nonen. Häyhä began his 15-month compulsory military service in the Bicycle Commissioned Officer School. Yet even then, he received no formal sniper training until 1938, just 1 year before the war that would make him legendary. According to Major Tapio Saarelainen, who later studied Häyhä extensively, the young soldier possessed an almost mystical ability to estimate distances up to 150 meters within a margin of error of just 1 meter. When the Soviet invasion began, Finland found itself in an impossible situation. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was exceptionally brutal, with temperatures on the Karelian Isthmus dropping to a record low of -43 degrees Celsius. While Finnish soldiers were accustomed to such conditions, having trained in their homeland's harsh climate, the Red Army had a policy of not training troops in temperatures lower than -15 Celsius. This would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Joseph Stalin had recently purged many of his military experts during the Great Purge of the late 1932, leaving the Red Army disorganized and poorly prepared for the unique challenges of fighting in Finland. The Soviet commanders expected their overwhelming numbers to crush Finnish resistance quickly, but they underestimated both the terrain and the determination of the Finnish people. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic David versus Goliath conflicts. Häyhä was assigned to serve under Lieutenant Arne Juutilainen in the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34 during what would become known as the Battle of Kollaa. This battle, fought from December 7th, 1939, to March 13th, 1940, in Ladoga, Karelia, would become one of the most difficult defensive actions of the entire Winter War. The Finnish 24th Regiment had entrenched themselves west of the Kollaa River after suffering defeats, and now they faced an almost impossible task. Kollaa was considered one of the most challenging locations to defend during the Winter War. The creek-sized Kollaa River was surrounded by soil so frozen that it was nearly impossible to dig proper defensive positions. The cold was so intense that metal became brittle and machinery failed regularly. Yet here, under the command of Major General Uiluo Tuompo, the Finns would face both the 9th and 14th Soviet armies. At one point, they were fighting against as many as 12 divisions, approximately 160,000 soldiers. The mathematical impossibility of their situation became clear when, during the height of the battle, only 32 Finnish soldiers stood against over 4,000 Soviets. Lieutenant Juutilainen, who had learned guerrilla warfare tactics during his service in the French Foreign Legion, trained his men with methods that earned them the nickname the Dread of Morocco. His unit, including Häyhä, was ordered to defend Kollaa at all costs. When Major General Hägglund asked the famous question, "Will Kollaa hold?" Juutilainen's reply became legendary. "Kollaa will hold, unless the orders are to run away." This simple exchange entered the Finnish lexicon as an expression of perseverance and resolve that would define the entire Winter War. It was in this frozen hell that Simo Häyhä would begin his transformation from farmer to legend. Armed with his Finnish-produced M28-30 rifle, a variant of the Mosin Nagant, and dressed in complete white camouflage, he became invisible against the snowy landscape. While Soviet troops wore dark uniforms that made them easily visible against the white terrain, Häyhä had learned to become one with the winter itself. His tactics were as brilliant as they were deadly. He preferred iron sights over scopes, understanding that telescopic sights could glare in the sunlight and reveal his position. The iron sights were more reliable in the extreme cold and wouldn't cloud up like optical equipment. This decision, seemingly simple, gave him a crucial advantage that would contribute to his extraordinary success. Häyhä developed techniques that seemed almost supernatural to his enemies. He would put snow in his mouth to hide his breath from being visible in the frigid air, even in temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius. He created snow piles as cover, making himself nearly invisible in his white camouflage suit. Wrapping himself in thick, heavy snowsuits and wearing fur mittens and a sniper mask, he could remain motionless for hours, waiting for the perfect shot. Each day, he would venture into the wilderness carrying only a day's worth of supplies and ammunition. His killing zone became a place of terror for Soviet soldiers, who began to whisper about the ghost in the snow who could strike without warning. The psychological impact of his presence was as devastating as his actual kills, as enemy morale plummeted and soldiers became afraid to venture into the open. As the battle for Kollaa intensified and the Soviet forces pressed their massive numerical advantage, one question remained. Could this quiet farmer from Rautjärvi truly stand against an entire army? The answer would come written in snow and blood across the frozen battlefields of Finland, where legend and reality would merge in the most extraordinary display of marksmanship the world had ever witnessed. The frozen forests of Kollaa became Häyhä's hunting ground, and every dawn brought new opportunities for death. His rifle, carefully maintained despite the brutal cold, became an extension of his will. The M28-30 had been modified to perfection, its action smooth even when temperatures dropped far below what most weapons could endure. Each morning, as the pale winter sun cast long shadows across the snow, Häyhä would slip into his white camouflage and disappear into the wilderness like morning mist. His hunting methodology was precise and calculated. Unlike the chaotic battles raging elsewhere along the front, Häyhä's war was fought in silence and solitude. He would study Soviet patrol patterns for days, memorizing their routes, timing their habits. When movements, learning a target presented itself, there was no he's, no second guessing. Onitation, shot, one kill, then immediate relocation to avoid counter-sniper fire. The Soviets quickly realized they had a serious problem. Reports began filtering back to headquarters about mysterious deaths among forward reconnaissance units. Soldiers would venture into the forest and simply never return. Others would be found with single bullet wounds, their positions suggesting they never saw their killer. Panic began to spread through the ranks as word of the phantom sniper reached every Soviet unit in the sector. Soviet commanders attempted various countermeasures. They sent entire squads to hunt the lone sniper, but these search parties often became victims themselves. Artillery barrages were called down on suspected sniper positions, turning sections of forest into moonscapes of shattered trees and crater-marked snow. Counter-snipers were deployed with the best equipment the Red Army could provide, yet they found themselves outmatched by a farmer with iron sights and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The winter itself became Häyhä's greatest ally. While Soviet soldiers struggled with frostbite and equipment failures, he thrived in conditions that would kill ordinary men. His body had adapted to the extreme cold through years of hunting in Finnish winters. Where others saw a hostile environment, he saw home. Every snow-covered hill, every frozen stream, every wind-blown drift was familiar territory that he could use to his advantage. By January 1940, Häyhä's reputation had spread beyond the immediate battlefield. Soviet soldiers began referring to him as the White Death, though some historians suggest this nickname originated from Finnish propaganda rather than enemy forces. Regardless of its origin, the name captured the essence of what Häyhä had become, a specter of death moving unseen through the white wilderness. The psychological warfare aspect of his campaign was as devastating as the physical casualties. Soviet morale plummeted as soldiers realized that nowhere was safe. Men who had survived the brutal purges and political upheavals of Stalin's Russia found themselves terrorized by an invisible enemy who could strike at any moment. Sleep became difficult. Simple tasks like gathering firewood or retrieving supplies became exercises in terror. Finnish intelligence reports described the growing paranoia among soldiers. While Soviet units refused to leave their positions during daylight hours. Officers struggled to maintain discipline as men became increasingly reluctant to follow orders that might expose them to the White Death. Some units requested transfers away from the Kollaa sector, preferring to face conventional battles elsewhere rather than continue hunting ghosts in the snow. Meanwhile, Häyhä's kill count continued to climb at an unprecedented rate. Military historians would later calculate that he was averaging approximately 5 kills per day throughout the campaign. This number seems impossible until one considers the target-rich environment he operated in. Soviet forces were constantly probing Finnish defensive positions, sending reconnaissance patrols and assault teams into areas where Häyhä waited with infinite patience. His weapon of choice remained the trusty M28-30, but he also carried a Suomi submachine gun for close-quarters encounters. When Soviet forces managed to locate his general position and moved in for the kill, Häyhä would switch tactics. The same man who could place precise shots at extreme range could also engage multiple enemies at close range with devastating effectiveness. At least half of his confirmed kills were achieved with the submachine gun during these intense firefights. The Battle of Kollaa became legendary not just for Häyhä's individual achievements, but for the collective heroism of the Finnish defenders. The phrase "Kollaa holds" became a rallying cry throughout Finland as news of the desperate defense spread. Citizens followed radio reports with intense interest, knowing that their freedom depended on a handful of soldiers holding an impossible line against overwhelming odds. Soviet casualties after attack was mounted as attack repelled. The frozen ground made burying the dead nearly impossible, and corpses accumulated in grotesque piles around Finnish defensive positions. The sight of so many fallen comrades, many bearing the precise wounds that marked Häyhä's handiwork, further demoralized the attacking forces. What was supposed to be a quick conquest had become a nightmare of attrition. As February arrived, bringing with it even more brutal cold, Häyhä's legend continued to grow. Finnish newspapers, desperate for good news from the front, began reporting on the mysterious sniper who was single-handedly holding back the Soviet advance. His exploits were celebrated in towns and villages across Finland, giving hope to a population that had watched in horror as their tiny nation was invaded by one of the world's great powers. But fame came with a price. Soviet commanders, increasingly frustrated by their inability to capture or kill the White Death, began dedicating significant hunt. Elite resources to Dneprs were brought in from other fronts. Artillery strikes became more frequent and more accurate. The net was tightening around the ghost in the snow. February 17th, 1940, marked a significant milestone in Häyhä's campaign. Exactly 80 days after the Soviet invasion began, he was officially proclaimed a hero of Finland by the government. The recognition came with tangible rewards including the Cross of Kollaa and a promotion from corporal directly to second lieutenant, a jump in rank that was unprecedented in Finnish military history. Perhaps most significantly, he was presented with a custom-built Sako rifle, crafted specifically for his use by Finland's finest gunsmiths. Yet even as accolades poured in, head on his deadly hay remained focus work. The war was far from over, and Soviet forces continued their relentless pressure against Finnish positions. Every day brought new targets, new opportunities to thin the enemy ranks and buy precious time for his country's survival. The frozen battlefield of Kollaa had become a testing ground where one man's skill and determination stood against the might of an empire. As March approached, bringing with it the possibility of peace negotiations, the question remained whether the White Death could continue his incredible streak or whether the odds would finally catch up with Finland's greatest sniper. The clock was ticking toward what would become the most consequential moment of Häyhä's legendary campaign. March had arrived with its promise of lengthening days and the possibility of peace talks, but the White Death showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, his accuracy had become even more deadly, as the weeks of constant combat had honed his skills to an almost supernatural level. Soviet forces, now desperate to eliminate the phantom who had haunted them for over 3 months, intensified their efforts to locate and destroy the man who had become the symbol of Finnish resistance. The pressure was mounting from the highest levels of Soviet command. Stalin himself had grown furious at reports of a single Finnish sniper terrorizing entire divisions. Orders came down through the chain of command that the White Death must be eliminated at all costs. Special units were formed specifically to hunt Häyhä, equipped with the Red Army's most advanced optics and supported by artillery observers who could call down devastating barrages at a moment's notice. Häyhä was well aware that his luck was running thin. After months of operating in the same general area, even his masterful camouflage and fieldcraft could not completely hide his presence from determined hunters. Soviet counter-snipers had begun using more sophisticated tactics, working in teams and employing indirect observation methods to locate his positions. The net was closing, but the farmer-turned legend refused to retreat from his hunting grounds. On the morning of March 6th, 1940, Häyhä prepared for what would unknowingly be his final hunt as the White Death. The temperature had risen slightly, hovering around -30°C, and a light snow was falling, providing additional cover for his movements. He selected a position overlooking a known Soviet approach route, settling into a shallow depression he had used successfully several times before. The familiarity of the location would prove to be both blessing and curse. As the pale winter sun climbed higher, casting its weak light across the battlefield, Häyhä spotted movement in the distance. A Soviet patrol was advancing cautiously through the trees, their dark uniforms stark against the white background. He counted 8 soldiers moving in a loose formation, their weapons ready but their movements betraying the nervousness that had plagued Soviet forces throughout the campaign. These men knew they were entering the White Death's domain. Häyhä selected his first target with the same calm deliberation that had marked every shot of his incredible campaign. The lead soldier, probably a sergeant based on his position and equipment, presented a clear profile at approximately 200 meters. The range was well within Häyhä's capabilities, and the wind was minimal. He controlled his breathing, feeling his heartbeat slow as he entered the meditative state that preceded each kill. The shot echoed across the frozen landscape with the sharp crack that had become the soundtrack of Soviet nightmares. The sergeant crumpled instantly, his rifle spinning away into the snow. The remaining soldiers immediately threw themselves to the ground, seeking whatever cover the sparse forest could provide. But their panic only made them easier targets for the master marksman who had been perfecting this deadly dance for months. Häyhä worked methodically through the patrol, each shot placed with surgical precision. Within minutes, 6 of the 8 soldiers lay motionless in the snow, their blood creating dark stains against the pristine white surface. The 2 survivors had managed to crawl behind a fallen tree, but they were trapped, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to the ghost who seemed to anticipate their every move. What Häyhä did not know was that this patrol had been specifically equipped with new radio equipment, and their sudden silence had immediately alerted Soviet artillery observers to his location. For the first time in his campaign, he had eliminated a target that carried modern communications gear, technology that would prove to be his undoing. Within minutes of the last shot, Soviet artillery began ranging in on his position. The first shells landed wide, exploding harmlessly in the trees behind Häyhä's position. But the artillery observers were skilled professionals, and they quickly adjusted their fire. The second salvo landed closer, close enough that Häyhä could feel the concussion waves through the frozen ground. He knew it was time to relocate, but as he began to move from his position, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. A Soviet sniper team had been tracking the sound of his shots, using triangulation methods to narrow down his location. As Häyhä rose to move, he caught a glimpse of reflected light in the distance, the telltale glint of a telescopic sight catching the winter Sunday. He threw himself sideways just as the enemy sniper fired, but the explosive bullet caught him squarely in the lower left jaw. The impact was devastating beyond description. The specialized ammunition, designed to cause maximum damage to human tissue, shattered Häyhä's jaw and blew away a large portion of his left cheek. The force of the blow sent him spinning through the air before he crashed face first into the snow, blood immediately staining the white surface bright red. For a moment, the forest fell silent except for the distant rumble of approaching artillery. The pain was indescribable, but somehow Häyhä remained conscious. Through the haze of agony and shock, he could hear Soviet voices shouting in the distance as enemy soldiers moved toward his position. His rifle lay several feet away, blown from his hands by the impact of the bullet. Blood filled his mouth and throat, making it difficult to breathe, and his vision was blurred by tears and trauma. Using every ounce of his remaining strength, Häyhä began crawling toward the finish lines. Each movement sent waves of agony through his shattered face, and he left a clear trail of blood in the snow that any competent tracker could follow. But the alternative was capture or death, and the White Death was not ready to surrender either his life or his secrets to the enemy. The journey back to Finnish positions, normally a matter of minutes, became an epic struggle lasting hours. Häyhä crawled through snowdrifts and over frozen logs, stopping frequently to rest and gather strength. Soviet soldiers searched the area behind him, but the falling snow gradually covered his blood trail, and the approaching darkness made tracking increasingly difficult. When Finnish soldiers finally found him near their forward positions, many thought he was already dead. His face was so damaged that he was nearly unrecognizable, and the amount of blood he had lost would have killed most men. They immediately placed him with the other casualties, assuming that the White Death had finally paid the ultimate price for his months of defiance. It was only when a medic noticed his leg twitching that they realized Simo Häyhä was still alive. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Finnish defensive positions. Their legendary sniper, the man who had become the symbol of their resistance, was alive but barely clinging to life. Within minutes, he was loaded onto a stretcher and rushed toward the nearest field hospital, beginning a race against time that would determine whether the White Death would survive to see peace. The irony was not lost on those who witnessed the evacuation. For over 3 months, Häyhä had moved through the battlefield like a ghost, invisible and untouchable. Now he lay broken and bleeding, his legendary career ended by a single well-placed shot from an enemy he never saw coming. The hunter had finally become the hunted, and the price of his incredible success had been paid in blood and shattered bone. As the stretcher-bearers carried him away from the front lines, artillery shells began falling on his former position with renewed intensity. The Soviets, having finally located the White Death's hunting ground, were determined to erase every trace of the legend that had terrorized their forces. The forest erupted in explosions and flying debris, obliterating the snow-covered positions where history's greatest sniper had written his name in the annals of warfare. The medical team that received Häyhä at the field hospital had seen countless wounded soldiers throughout the brutal winter war, but nothing had prepared them for the extent of his injuries. Half of his face was simply gone, destroyed by the explosive ammunition that had finally claimed the White Death. The doctors worked frantically through the night, their hands steady despite the knowledge that they were operating on Finland's greatest war hero. Blood transfusions, emergency surgery, and desperate measures to stabilize his condition filled the early hours of March 7th. As surgeons fought to save his life, Häyhä slipped into a deep coma that would last 11 days. During this time, the world around him continued to turn. Finnish negotiators met with Soviet representatives in Moscow, hammering out the terms of a peace treaty that would end the Winter War. The fighting at Kollaa gradually subsided as both sides prepared for the inevitable conclusion of hostilities. Yet through it all, the unconscious sniper remained suspended between life and death, his legendary campaign hanging in the balance. The Finnish people followed news of his condition with intense interest. Radio broadcasts provided updates on the White Death's struggle for survival, and prayers were offered in churches across the nation. He had become more than just a soldier. He was the embodiment of Finnish determination, the proof that even the smallest nation could stand against overwhelming odds. His survival seemed almost as important as the peace negotiations themselves. Soviet forces, meanwhile, celebrated what they believed was the elimination of their most feared enemy. Reports filtered through their ranks that the phantom sniper had finally been killed, bringing relief to thousands of soldiers who had lived in terror of his invisible presence. Artillery continued to pound the forests around Kollaa, ensuring that no trace remained of the positions from which he had conducted his deadly campaign. On March 13th, 1940, two remarkable events occurred simultaneously. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed, officially ending the Winter War and ceding significant Finnish territory to the Soviet Union. At almost the same moment, in a military hospital far from the front lines, Simo Häyhä opened his eyes for the first time in 11 days. The White Death had awakened to find that his war was over, his face forever changed, and his legend secure for all time. The man who emerged from that coma was physically transformed but spiritually unbroken, though his face would remain disfigured for the rest of his life. Requiring years of reconstructive surgery and rehabilitation, his spirit remained as strong as the winter winds that had concealed his movements. When asked years later about his incredible achievement, Häyhä would give the most humble answer imaginable. The secret to his success, he claimed, was simply practice. The White Death had awakened to a world forever changed, just as he had forever changed the nature of warfare itself. In 100 days of bitter combat, Simo Häyhä transformed from an unknown farmer into history's deadliest sniper, proving that courage and skill could triumph over overwhelming odds. His 500 confirmed kills stand as a testament to what one determined individual can accomplish when defending everything he holds dear. The Winter War ended with Finland losing territory but keeping its independence, a victory paid for in blood by heroes like Häyhä. The psychological impact of his campaign extended far beyond the frozen forests of Kollaa. Soviet forces learned to fear the unseen enemy, while the Finnish people discovered that even the mightiest empire could be challenged by ordinary citizens with extraordinary resolve. Häyhä's legacy transcends mere numbers. He embodied the spirit of resistance that defines a nation's character when faced with extinction. The humble farmer who simply practiced until perfection became legend reminds us that heroes often emerge from the most unexpected places. In the depths of winter darkness, when hope seemed lost and defeat inevitable, one man with an old rifle and iron determination proved that legends are not born, but forged in the crucible of desperate times.